Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending this session today. My name is Pieter Kasselman. I'm going to talk about trusted cross-device flows. And this is work that's being done by, I'm representing 4 people. So myself, Daniel Fett from yes.com, and then Christina Bauer and Pedro Massani, who are researchers from the University of Stuttgart. I think first, so let's talk a little bit about the next 25 minutes. So I'm going to talk very quickly about what a cross-device flow is, why do they matter, some of the problems that we're encountering, and then I'm going to talk about a multi-pronged approach that we're beginning to look at, some practical mitigations, beginning to think about what we could do with alternatives in terms of protocols, and then also some foundational underpinnings, so that when we come up with new solutions, we actually have some solid analysis in place for it. I'll talk also a little bit about next steps as well. So I think first of all, cross-device flow, just what is a cross-device flow? We think about cross-device flows as a flow that is initiated on one device and then authorized on another one. So let's say your smart TV comes up, shows you a QR code, you take your phone, you scan the QR code, you authenticate and authorize, and Netflix start playing on your smart TV. So that's kind of the kind of thing that we think about as a cross-device flow. So a little bit more just in terms of what also happens on the back end with these flows. So typically, you'll have a consumption device, and they will get and display a code for the user. The user will then scan it, enter it on a device, they authenticate, and they give authorization. And at that point, the authorization server will release tokens. The consumption device will retrieve them, and they will content will be displayed on the device. And so that's it's pretty magical. It's a great flow, and it's a very common motion. And users have become very accustomed to scanning QR codes. It's a ceremony, right? You see a QR code, and you know you have to scan it, right? It's become that common. However, so very convenient, right? Allows you to initiate the session on one device, authorize on the second. So this helps with devices with limited input capabilities, and also gives you strong authentication with a personally trusted device. However, there is one small thing to be mindful of, and it's the gap, the air gap between the device, the consumption device, and the authorization device. And the thing to keep in mind, right, the challenge that happens here is this is an unauthenticated channel. And there's no protocol for the user to establish any trust between these two devices. So basically what we do in the protocol design is we say to the user, it's up to you. You have to decide whether you trust, whether this QR code that you're scanning is trustworthy. And that's kind of contextual and left up to the user. But this is also the entry point where for social engineering attacks, and I'll explain a little bit more about how those work, but essentially, social engineering attacks are being used to get the user to perform what we call an illicit consent grant attack. So basically, just get the user to scan a code and say yes. So how do they do that? So our friendly attacker sets up their own device. They retrieve a code, and they change the context. So let's say you're connecting to a SharePoint site. You obtain one of these codes, and you don't present it to the user as, hey, authorize access to your SharePoint files. You present it to the user as something that says, hey, your SharePoint files are about to be deleted. Please re-authenticate. Or another version of that is, hey, congratulations, you won the lotto. Please enter this code, right? And you enter the code, and oh, you have to authorize something, yes, but you won the lotto, right? You're going to complete the action. There are versions of this at bus stops, rental bikes, where people take these authorization codes, they take them from one bike, they put them on another bike, somebody comes along, they scan it. The bike doesn't unlock, but the bike down the street does, and the bike thief makes off with a bike. So it sounds a little bit strange, but these attacks are real, and it's actually a method for token theft. So the user falls for the trick, they authenticate, and the tokens are retrieved, and now the attacker has access to access and refresh tokens, and they have access to your data. This is one of many ways in which tokens are exfiltrated. There are variations on this. One of them is you do this a couple of times, you get maybe 100 or so tokens, and you go sell them to someone who would need them, say in a gaming context, for example. There's some other interesting things about this attack, right? It is not really phishing, but it uses the same social engineering tricks, but it also ends up bypassing multi-factor authentication. You can have as many layers of authentication on step 4 there as you like. The user has already decided to grant access, right? They took the bait. And so at this point, really what we've designed, we put all the responsibility on the user. And I call this, we design for a homo securitas, right? We design for a security expert, somebody who knows the protocol, somebody who understands what they should do. They're really laser focused, and they would be a foolproof mitigation for this. And there may even be some of them in this room. But they're a rare species, right? Because in reality, this is who we're working with, right? It's Homo sapiens. Expertise elsewhere, super, super smart at something other than authentication and authorization protocols. They're busy. They need to get things done. They worry about breaking things. They usually want to help. And so what we need to think about as we try and mitigate against this is, how can we help the user to make fewer decisions? How can we help them to make better decisions if they have to make a decision? But also, when they make a bad decision, how do we protect them, right? Because as long as we have Homo sapiens around, we will have to take into account the fail cases as well. So how do we advance the state of the art? This is one of my favorite quotes. Always start by doing what's necessary. So what can we do with the existing protocol set? What is the pragmatic things that we can go do? And then there's some other things that's possible. And who knows, maybe we could even defeat our attackers on this one eventually. So to get there, we're proposing a three-pronged approach at this point. One, a set of pragmatic mitigations. We're beginning to explore some alternatives. There's some really exciting work happening in the FIDO Alliance, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, that may point to a path forward. And then foundational underpinnings. Getting to a place where we have proofs through formal methods that allows us to actually assess whether the mitigations that we're deploying is having an impact and is working. So let's talk about some pragmatic mitigations. So what are the things that we can do to prevent, interrupt, or recover from these attacks? First one is proximity. If you can prevent the QR code or the user code from being moved, or if you can at least prove that it is being displayed in the place it was meant to be displayed, or that the device scanning it is scanning it in the place where you would expect it to be scanned, and those two both the consumption device and the authorization device or authentication device are actually co-located. That is a huge step towards prevention and interruption. And there's a number of protocols out there or opportunities out there to do that. Some of it is through geolocation, looking up at the back end. Maybe there's something we can do over the network locally. Dave's been talking about that. And maybe leveraging things even like Bluetooth, et cetera, right? And there's content filtering, right? So when these social engineering emails go out, can we detect that there's authorization codes, or can we detect that there is user codes or QR codes that's being distributed in spray attacks, et cetera, right? So is there some work that we can do when a user code gets generated to hook that up to the content filtering side of things? Also, what metadata can we put into the user code or into the QR code? Again, location information, time constraints, right? So that these things only live or is only valid for a short while. I talked yesterday about sender constraining tokens using Depop. That's another mitigation that is definitely useful here, right? So making it so that even if the attacker manages to steal the token, they cannot actually move it off the device that they have it. It'll mitigate against some classes of attackers, right? Those folks who are harvesting tokens for commercial purposes. Some of the other attackers who maybe have other motivations may actually, it's not necessarily gonna stop them. They may be happy to keep using a stolen token on a dedicated device. Another one is trusted devices, right? So should we actually, or could we constrain it so that these protocols are only used with trusted devices, devices that are pre-registered, via either something like the FIDO onboarding specification or through TPMs, et cetera. There's some work happening around secure QR codes in OASIS, and so that could be another path for us to explore. And then user experience. If you look at consent screens these days, it's not always clear for the user what they're consenting to. And I think definitely plenty of opportunity for guidance about what that might look like. I think there's other options too. I think even guidance around scoping of the tokens when they're issued will help with mitigating risks when the attacks do succeed. We're also looking at some alternatives. One of these, today we have a hierarchy of, let's call it authentication techniques, right? There's passwords, there's SMS codes, there's hardware devices. And we sort of have an idea of how these things build. And likewise, right, do we need to actually start providing guidance on use of different protocols for different purposes? So Device Authorization Grant is commonly used, but it's also perhaps the one that is most easily exploited. CIBA, the Client-Initiated Backchannel Authentication protocol from the OpenID Foundation, that actually makes things a little bit harder, right? Different model. And then finally, Authorization Code Grant, especially combined with the latest work with passkeys, with WebAuthn, and the new hybrid connectivity model. So in that model, you would recall that I talked about proximity as being a key mitigation. So what we potentially get with something like passkey and the hybrid model, or the hybrid transport, is you get the proximity assurance through the Bluetooth connection, but you have the high bandwidth connection on via the WebSocket, and then it's just a WebAuthn authentication. And the beauty about that is the whole cross-device issue sort of really goes away, and it's no harder to phish or to try and confuse a user using that approach than, say, just a regular authentication or authorization flow. So this is another thing that we're beginning to look at, is what guidance do we give? Is there more that we need to do around these? The final one is around the foundational underpinnings. So I'm going to briefly talk. This is work that was done by Christina Bauer at the University of Stuttgart. So she started performing some initial formal analysis of a cross-device flow fix. And the idea in this is, for the display and consumption of that QR code, is that actually that can be moved onto a separate stub, right, in a different destination. And and that is sort of another step in the right direction. I think there's also the question about, well, does that actually introduce, do we just move the problem to a different place, but we still have the homo securitas problem, because now you need to sort of have this binding between the authorization device and the cross-device stub. But it's very promising, and it's sort of a beginning and gives us a foundation for future work. And there is now work, Pedro Musani is looking into actually doing a complete formal analysis from device code flow, for example. So that's sort of work I think that we can look forward to in the future. Then finally, I think that's our three-pronged approach. So I think in terms of next steps, what we really want to do here is start describing these known attacks, publish some best practices documents, also the idea of cross-device protocols, explore that idea further, and then the work with researchers. So also a call to action for folks here in this room or anybody who may watch this recording. We're looking for help, right? This is actually, defeating social engineering attacks is really, really difficult. Attackers are super creative. So if you come across new attacks or you see interesting new mitigations, please contact us, Daniel Fett or myself. Also Pedro and Christina, I'm sure, are interested too. And then specifically, if you have questions around the formal analysis and the research that is happening about more secure social engineering resistant protocols, Pedram and Christina are two of the researchers at the University of Stuttgart that you can contact as well. And I don't know, let's see. So yeah, so that's what we think. What do you think? Thank you. Thanks for your time. Oh, I see hands. I think that gentleman there went up first.
So obviously, like within the standards and a lot of other things, like levels of authentication are clearly defined. But like what you're talking about in the QR code, it's really the correlation factors, right? That are like basically coupling two disparate devices together. So like those correlation factors, is there any type of standardization that's underway to kind of like be able to put those on a gradient scale and say like these are more secure than others, or like best practices in that space? Is that kind of where this heads toward, or?
Not yet, but it is something, I think that work that we're proposing around looking at the existing set of protocols and just even establishing a hierarchy and some recommendation. Yeah, I think that I'd be very interested to hear where the appropriate places are to do that. But yes, that, is it a best practice document? Is it, but yes, I think it is worth doing. I talk about expertise elsewhere a lot. And we talked about it in the context of consumers here. It also applies to engineers. The engineers who are implementing these systems they're experts at video streaming, or they're experts at productivity software. They're not experts in authorization and authentication protocols. And many times, they look at it and say, oh, it's a standard. It solves my problem. Smarter people than me may have looked at it. I should just implement that, right? And they do not necessarily always appreciate some of the trade-offs that was made in the design. I had somebody in the front here, yeah?
Can you elaborate on the device stub approach?
So I'm going to sort of, this is not my specific area of expertise. So Christina actually is the person that you should reach out to, or Pedram. But the idea is that instead of rendering the QR code on, on the local device, that is actually rendered in a separate stub that may still be displayed on the device, but it's a way. I think from the way I understand that work, it's a way to start putting a boundary around this QR code that we're trying to make more assertions about where it is being displayed, where it is being rendered, et cetera, right? But I would really encourage you to reach out to Christina and Pedram on this topic. Oh, there was a question at the, I'll go back to. Yes. There's a number of proposals and ideas, even, just if the devices are on the same network, right? Or if the QR code is being displayed on the same network as the device that's scanning it, that's already another, it may be, it's like, it's not, how to put it, it may not be right next to it, but it's at least maybe in the same building. And we've even talked about simple things like just geolocation based on IP or other indicators, so that when the QR code is being displayed in continent A, somebody in continent B shouldn't be scanning it, right? The impossible travel scenario should be able to be prevented. But yes, and if you have more ideas, I'd love to hear about that. We are beginning to write up all the possible options for implementers. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. You?
My name is Susan.
Susan.
You can go to the previous slide so we can get the snapshot.
Oh, of course. Yes.
Is there a way of leveraging the device ID in this scenario, based on what you guys have just displayed, where, before the QR code is being sent, you capture the device?
Absolutely, and I sort of rushed over it a little bit, but one of the mitigations is trusted devices. And so if you had a device ID that you have previously registered with the system, you may actually have higher confidence that that device should be allowed to display a QR code. For example, with TPMs, right? When the TPMs are manufactured, or with FIDO, right? Some of the onboarding, the IoT, some of the onboarding specifications, at the time of manufacture, a device ID or a key is created, and you can use that later to say, well, here's the device. I actually did buy this device if I'm an enterprise user, and that can be used as a form of attestation or as a way to establish trust. It's another layer, but yes, absolutely. Yes?
In one of those pictures, you were mentioning CIBA as an unauthenticated channel.
Yeah, so I can clarify what I meant by that. I think it's, okay, let's go back to it here, right, this one. So basically what I mean by it is the session between there's a break in the protocol, right, or there's a break in authentication. There's an error gap, and that error gap is unauthenticated. And it's true for CIBA as well as for device authorization code, right? There's this error gap. But then if you go authorization code grant path, that error gap actually kind of disappears because of the hybrid flow. If you use the hybrid flow, you establish the proximity, you actually have authentication. And I talk about authentication between the screen or the place where it's displayed and the place where you're going to authorize.
So with CIBA, you can still, like somebody in Europe can approve that.
Right, and where CIBA works a little bit differently, but yeah, there are sort of, let's call it spray attacks, right, where let's say I know that, I have a list of phone numbers, right, and I can just sort of initiate for all the phone numbers, and that may translate into, 100,000 messages in Europe popping up, and somebody's going to say yes, right? So you still have these sort of social engineering type attacks. Yes?
Has anything been written up about the cross-device stubs? I just did a quick search and I couldn't find it.
So Christina recently completed her master's thesis. I think it's been published, and if you reach out to her, I think she'll be happy to share a copy with you. Yeah. Yes?
Talk about user experience, and isn't there a portion of authorization servers to tell the user this is a login for this device on this location? Because the authorization server does have its own solutions.
Yes, that would help. I think that is a step, but it's probably not the only step. I just think about how easily users get confused, or how how clever, at the OAuth security workshop, there was a wonderful presentation from people who are targeted by these things, and it's amazing how clever these social engineering attacks are, and it's all about getting the user to want to say yes, right? And at some point, you cannot stop that. But you're right, better user experience and more consistent user experience, right? I think that's another thing that is challenging. If I go, if I use 2 or 3 different services and they're all different, I have to learn 2 or 3 different ways to give consent, right? It's different paradigms. So yeah, there's just a ton of work there. Oh, okay. Well, if anybody has more questions, please let me know. Happy to take more.